Pelicans get the tip. Your officials: Eric Lewis, Derrick Collins, and Benny Adams. Ingram had 30 points 2 nights ago. Jones Jr. with the first block of the game.
Stayed with them.
Blazers 8 blocks as a team in the first matchup against the Pelicans 48 hours ago. Cross-court pass, ball and Bledsoe bunched up in the corner. Bledsoe under 5 to shoot, has to put it up. Misses everything. Jones Jr. with the loose ball. Here's Lillard trying to shake Ingram. Jones Jr. will square up. Cantor taps it back out to Trent Jr. Cantor taps it back out to Trent Jr. Covington back to Trent Jr.
Oh!
Jones Jr. cleaning it up.
He was on a runway.
Cantor taps it back out to Trent Jr. Covington back to Trent Jr.
Oh!
Jones Jr. cleaning it up.
He was on a runway.
Pelicans shooting just 37% on 13 of 35 shooting. Hayes tied up by Jones Jr., and that'll be a foul on the Blazers. 31 of 31. Set a franchise record for most makes without a miss. Jones Jr. splits a pair. Trying to create some space. Ball over to Bledsoe. He'll pump fake. Going to the lane. Tries to draw contact, and we do have a whistle on the floor. Foul on Jones Jr.
They're trying to show that second defender more rather than letting that person lay back.
Ingram trying to attack Jones Jr. Blazers tie up Adams. Get the ball. Wrestles away another rebound. Jones Jr. in transition, attacking Ingram, goes reverse, too strong.
Good take though, you know I like it.
Williamson trying to go baseline, pawed at by Jones Jr., knocked out of bounds.
Beat him to the spot, quick feet. It forces them to have to spend those possessions closing by finding the body, boxing out.
Jones Jr., a look from outside, no good. Cantor, good. Trying to check Dame. They send the double team over. It's still Dame with Adams on him. Drives by him. Ball cuts him off. Jones Jr. gets it up before the shot clock. Lillard offensive rebound in the paint. Lillard trying to feed a pass. Knocked loose. Jones Jr. trying to feather his way to the cup, and that's going to be an offensive foul against Jones Jr. Lillard trying to feed a pass. Knocked loose. Jones Jr. trying to feather his way to the cup, and that's going to be an offensive foul against Jones Jr. Tries to find Jones Jr. cutting on the baseline. Jones Jr. staying with it. Tries to find Jones Jr. cutting on the baseline. Jones Jr. staying with it. Tries to find Jones Jr. cutting on the baseline. Jones Jr. staying with it.
Timely cut from DJ.
I just heard taste and I was hungry. Blazers, another steal by the Pelicans. Ingram.
Oh, go get that.
Jones Jr. with the pack.
Go get that.
Williamson denied. I just heard taste and I was hungry. Blazers, another steal by the Pelicans. Ingram.
Oh, go get that.
Jones Jr. with the pack.
Go get that.
Williamson denied. Chaos on the floor at the moment. 7 to shoot for Ingram. They'll try a lengthy 2 and the stop by Portland.
He's standing room only right now for that athleticism.
Blazers hungry on defense. Jones Jr. can't get the triple. Loose ball, foul on the floor, and his Cantor pumping his fist. That's his 24th game this season with 30-plus points, tied with Bradley Beal for tops in the league. Lewis. Jones Jr. on the wing, tries to go by Williamson. Williamson. Quick reaction for the block, and Lillard gets it back to Lillard. Lillard splits through 3 defenders. Jones Jr. over to Covington. Covington, a long 3, catches in.
That's a big shot because after Dame made the pass, he kept running.
Trent Jr. defended closely by Bledsoe. Tries to turn the corner. Back outside. Jones Jr. 4-3. Got it. This time trying to play off Covington. Goes by Ingram. Jones Jr. 2 to shoot over Zion.